Hey, old man, you gonna leave some food for the rest of us or what? The voice cut through the quiet murmur of the diner like a knife. Frank Wallace didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, much worse. The kind of words that left scars, not on your skin, but in your mind. He stirred his coffee, taking a slow sip as the laughter echoed behind him. The clatter of plates and the hum of conversation continued around him, but he knew that all eyes were shifting his way. "You deaf or something, Grandpa?" Another voice chimed in, louder this time, and the group of young men at the next table erupted in snickers. Their leader, a cocky kid named Chris, stood up, sauntering over to Frank's table like he owned the place. Frank didn't look up, didn't react. His military instincts had taught him control, how to stay calm in the face of fire. He'd been through worse than a few disrespectful boys. But the young men didn't stop. They were itching for a reaction, and Frank knew it. He could feel the tension building, like the slow rise of a storm on the horizon. He knew their type, always looking for trouble, never expecting the consequences. He set his coffee cup down with a quiet clink, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an old, worn flip phone. He dialed a number, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world. "Yeah, it's me," Frank said softly into the phone. "I think it's time." He closed the phone, slid it back into his pocket, and leaned back in his chair, finally meeting Chris's gaze. "You boys should finish your meal and get out of here while you still can." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of something they couldn't quite understand. But they would, soon enough. The laughter around Frank's table continued to ripple through the diner as Chris leaned closer, his smirk widening as he saw no immediate reaction from the old man. He was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation, and right now he wanted to embarrass the quiet veteran who sat before him. "Time for what, old man? Time for your afternoon nap?" Chris taunted, crossing his arms in a show of bravado. His friends chuckled behind him, egging him on. They were always looking for someone to tear down, and today it was Frank's turn. Frank's hands remained steady on the table, his face calm, like the surface of a lake untouched by the wind. He'd been through countless moments of disrespect since returning from the service. People who didn't understand, who saw him only as an aging relic, not knowing the depths of what he'd done or what he'd endured. "What's your problem, kid?" Frank finally asked, his voice low but firm. Chris blinked, surprised that the old man had finally spoken. He glanced back at his friends, who were grinning in anticipation. This was the part where the old guy would back down, get flustered, maybe even leave in embarrassment. They'd seen it happen plenty of times before. "My problem?" Chris echoed, stepping back as if he couldn't believe Frank had the nerve to talk back. "You're the problem, sitting here like you own the place, all quiet and holier than thou. You think we should all bow down because you're some kind of old war hero?" Frank's eyes met Chris's with an unwavering gaze. "You got it wrong, son. I don't expect anything from you, but you should learn to show some respect. It'll take you further than you know." Chris snorted and glanced at his buddies. "Respect? For what? For some old man who's probably never seen a day of action in his life? Give me a break." Before Frank could reply, the waitress, Emily, who had been watching the entire interaction from behind the counter, hurried over. Her face was pale with worry, her eyes darting between Frank and Chris. She placed a hand on Chris's arm, trying to diffuse the situation. "Chris, you should stop," Emily said softly, but with an edge of authority. "You don't know who you're talking to." Chris rolled his eyes. "Oh, spare me, Emily. What's he gonna do, tell war stories? Get over it." Emily looked at Frank, her expression pleading for him to let it go. She'd seen this kind of thing before, and she didn't want it to escalate. Frank met her gaze, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them. She knew about his past, about what he'd been through, and she knew he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Frank gave her a small nod, signaling that he was fine. He wasn't about to rise to the bait, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. These boys were hungry for a fight, and no amount of calm would stop them now. "You heard her," Frank said to Chris, his voice steady. Let it go. There's no need for this. Chris, feeling his bravado returning, smirked. You think I'm scared of you? He spat. You're just an old man, and this is our town. People like you don't belong here anymore. Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. I warned you once. I won't warn you again. Chris's smug smile faltered for a moment as he stared into Frank's calm but unwavering eyes. There was something unsettling in the veteran's demeanor, something Chris couldn't quite place, but the laughter and the taunts from his friends spurred him on. Warn me? What are you going to do, old man? Call in the cavalry? Chris mocked. Frank didn't flinch. He simply glanced down at his coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands. Sometimes, all it takes is one call, he said quietly. Before Chris could reply, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, keeping his focus on Frank, determined to maintain control over the situation. But the buzzing persisted, more insistent now. With a sigh, Chris pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. It was his father. The sight of his father's name made his stomach tighten with unease. His father was a stern man, someone who didn't tolerate disrespect. And Chris knew he was already on thin ice at home. He silenced the phone and stuffed it back into his pocket, his bravado returning. Looks like your cavalry didn't get the message, he sneered. Frank watched him carefully but said nothing. He'd seen this type of arrogance before, the kind that only faded when reality hit hard. And Frank knew that reality was coming sooner than these young men realized. That night, Frank sat alone on his porch, watching the stars blink into the evening sky. The events of the day replayed in his mind, but he felt no anger, no frustration. Just a quiet resolve that had been honed over decades of service. As the cool night air wrapped around him, his mind drifted back to his days in the military, the missions he had led, the men he had fought alongside. He wasn't always the quiet man he was now. There was a time when Sergeant Frank Wallace was known for his leadership, his bravery, and his unwavering loyalty to his brothers in arms. He thought of Lieutenant Marcus, Corporal Jensen, and Sergeant Morales, the men who had stood by his side through the fiercest battles. They weren't just soldiers. They were family. And though they had all gone their separate ways after the war, their bond had never broken. It was that bond that Frank had called upon today. His former unit had always promised to have each other's backs, no matter how many years passed. And now, they were on their way. Frank smiled to himself, knowing that Chris and his friends had no idea what was coming. The next day, Frank received a message confirming what he already knew. His old brothers were on their way. Lieutenant Marcus, the man who had once been Frank's second-in-command, was now a highly successful businessman. He had traded his combat boots for polished shoes, but the fire of loyalty to his unit still burned within him. Corporal Jensen, the youngest of the group, had settled down with a family but never lost his fighting spirit. And Sergeant Morales, the tactical genius of the unit, had taken his skills into the world of security, becoming a sought-after expert. They were older now, with families, jobs, and lives of their own, but when Frank called, they dropped everything. Because that's what brothers do. As they made their way to town, none of them knew exactly what awaited them, but they trusted Frank. And they knew, whatever the situation, they'd handle it together, just like they always had. Chris, along with his friends, had moved on from the incident at the diner, convinced that they had cowed the old man. They boasted about it all evening, patting themselves on the back for putting the old-timer in his place. They had no idea that Frank wasn't the type to bow down. The next day, they were hanging around the diner again, unaware that things were about to change. Frank hadn't returned to the diner yet, but Emily, the waitress, couldn't shake the tension that hung in the air. She had served the veterans in town long enough to know that Frank wasn't someone to be trifled with. There was a quiet strength about him that always set him apart. Emily had overheard Frank's calm warning, and something in his voice made her believe that the situation wasn't over. Later that afternoon, the young men gathered outside the diner. Chris, emboldened by the absence of consequences, nudged his friends toward Frank's old, worn truck parked nearby. "Hey, want to see how tough that old man really is?" Chris grinned, pulling a pocket knife from his jacket. His friends chuckled nervously, but no one stopped him as he approached the truck. With a swift motion, Chris ran the blade along one of the tires, a hiss of air escaping. "What's he gonna do about it, huh? Not so tough now." Chris turned to his friends, laughing at his own bravado. But inside, a nagging feeling was beginning to grow, a small, gnawing doubt. The sun was setting when Frank's old comrades arrived in town. They didn't come with fanfare or noise, but their presence was unmistakable. Lieutenant Marcus, Corporal Jensen, and Sergeant Morales had all grown older, just like Frank, but they still carried themselves with the confidence and discipline of men who had seen the world's hardest moments. They pulled up in a couple of black SUVs, stepping out in casual clothes that belied their strength and history. Frank greeted them outside his small home, a quiet nod exchanged between the men as they embraced like family. There was no need for words. They knew why they were there. "Good to see you, old man," Marcus said, clapping Frank on the back. "What kind of trouble did you get yourself into this time?" Frank smiled slightly. "It's not me. Just a couple of punks who don't know when to quit. Thought we'd teach them a little lesson." Jensen shook his head. "Some people never learn, huh?" "We'll take care of it," Morales said, ever the strategist. "But let's make sure we do it the right way." Frank nodded. His friends weren't here for revenge. They were here to remind those young men of something they clearly didn't understand: respect. The next morning, Frank and his former unit walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as they stepped inside. The place went quiet almost immediately. People in the diner glanced up, sensing the change in the atmosphere. It wasn't just because Frank was back, it was because of the men who stood beside him. Chris and his group of friends were sitting in their usual spot by the window, laughing over something. When they saw Frank walk in, their expressions faltered. Chris stood up, trying to act casual, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Frank walked straight up to the counter, greeting Emily with a nod. She smiled nervously, sensing the tension but unsure of what was about to unfold. Chris scoffed, crossing his arms. "Oh, look, the old man brought backup. What's this, some kind of reunion?" Marcus stepped forward, his posture relaxed but commanding. "You could say that," he said, his voice calm. "We're here to have a chat with you boys." The young men exchanged confused glances, but Chris wasn't ready to back down. "Chat about what? We don't owe you guys anything." "No, you don't," Frank said, his voice steady. "But you do owe some respect. You disrespected me. More than that, you disrespected every man who ever wore this uniform." Frank's words hung heavy in the air, the weight of them finally sinking in. "And we don't take that lightly," Marcus added, stepping closer to Chris, who was visibly starting to sweat. Chris's bravado was starting to crack. He could see it in the way his friends were glancing nervously at each other, in the way the men standing before him didn't flinch or back down. They weren't angry or aggressive, just firm, solid like the veterans they were. But it was their presence, the way they commanded the room, that was starting to get under Chris's skin. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it," one of Chris's friends stammered, clearly unnerved by the situation. Frank didn't respond, but Marcus stepped forward again, his eyes locked on Chris. "You think because you're young, because you're loud, that makes you tough?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "That's not what toughness is. Toughness is knowing when to walk away, when to show respect, when to back down before you cross a line you can't come back from." Chris swallowed hard, trying to maintain his tough guy facade, but it was slipping fast. He looked around the diner, realizing that every eye was on him, and suddenly he felt small, pathetically small. "You think this is a joke?" Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. "Frank here, he fought for the freedoms you take for granted every day. Men like him sacrificed everything so you could sit here, running your mouth without a care in the world." Jensen stepped in next, his voice softer but no less impactful. "This isn't about a few words or a stupid prank, kid. It's about understanding that there are people in this world who've earned your respect, whether you give it to them or not." The words hit Chris hard, and for the first time, he looked at Frank, really looked at him. There was no anger in the old man's eyes, no bitterness, just a calmness, an unshakable strength that Chris knew he'd never have. The humiliation washed over him, and for a second, Chris wanted to run, to get out of that diner as fast as possible. But he couldn't. Not yet. As Chris was trying to find the words to apologize, the door to the diner opened once again, and a familiar figure walked in. His father. The color drained from Chris's face as his father strode in, dressed in his business suit, his face set in a stern expression. Chris's father was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. And right now, Chris wasn't sure what to expect. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Chris asked, his voice shaky. His father's eyes shifted from Chris to Frank and the veterans standing beside him. There was a moment of silence before his father walked over to Frank and extended a hand. "Frank, it's been a long time." Frank smiled slightly and shook his hand. "Good to see you, John." Chris's mouth dropped open. You know him?" His father nodded. "Frank saved my life, son, back in the war. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be here." Chris's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of his actions came crashing down. He had been harassing a man who had not only served his country, but had saved his own father's life. "Dad, I didn't know," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. His father's gaze hardened. "You didn't care to know." The silence in the diner was deafening. Chris stood there, feeling the weight of his father's words like a ton of bricks. He looked around, realizing that every person in the room was waiting for his next move. The smug grin he had worn earlier had long since vanished. In its place was a dawning understanding that he had crossed a line, one that he could never have imagined. Chris swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't know," he repeated, but this time it was more a plea for forgiveness than an excuse. Frank stepped forward, his weathered face calm but not unkind. He could see the conflict in the young man's eyes. "We all make mistakes, son," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "But respect isn't something you give just because you have to. It's something you give because it's right, and it's earned." Chris's eyes darted between Frank and his father, the realization that this man, this quiet, unassuming veteran, had saved his father's life in a moment of life-or-death terror during the war. The enormity of that weighed heavily on his chest. "I'm sorry," Chris whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were, what you've done." Frank gave him a small nod, accepting the apology but knowing the lesson went beyond mere words. "It's not about me, son. It's about learning to show respect to everyone, whether they're wearing a uniform or not. You don't know what someone's been through. You don't know their story." Chris looked down at the floor, shame washing over him. The friends who had backed him up before were silent now, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that none of them had expected this confrontation to take such a serious turn. Frank's comrades, Lieutenant Marcus, Jensen, and Morales, watched quietly. They weren't here for revenge or to teach the young men a lesson through intimidation. They were here to back up their friend and reinforce the values they had lived by their entire lives: respect, loyalty, and brotherhood. Chris's father, John, finally broke the silence. "Son, if you're really sorry, then show it. It's not enough to apologize. It's how you act going forward that matters." Chris nodded, his head hanging low. He had been given a second chance and he knew he couldn't waste it. The days following the diner incident were tense for Chris. Everywhere he went, people in town had heard about how the group of cocky young men had been humbled by a quiet veteran and his old war buddies. Chris couldn't escape the whispers, the judgment in people's eyes, or the way the story seemed to follow him. His friends were trying to act like it hadn't bothered them, but Chris could see the shift in their behavior. They were quieter now, more reserved, but Chris felt the weight of it more than any of them. He couldn't shake the guilt, the shame. And so he spent the next few days wrestling with his pride, trying to figure out how to make things right. His father had been clear. Apologies meant nothing without actions to back them up. And Chris knew that if he truly wanted to atone for what he had done, he would have to swallow his pride and face Frank again. Chris drove to Frank's house on a chilly Saturday morning. He had rehearsed what he was going to say, but as he stood in front of the old veteran's door, his mind went blank. His hand hovered over the doorbell, hesitating, before finally pressing it. After a moment, Frank appeared at the door, his weathered face impassive but not unkind. "Chris." Frank greeted him simply, stepping aside to let him in. Chris entered the small, humble home. It wasn't what he expected. There were photos of Frank in his military days, moments of his life captured in faded, framed pictures on the walls. Chris's eyes lingered on a photo of a much younger Frank in his uniform, standing with his brothers in arms. "I didn't know," Chris said quietly, breaking the silence. "About you. About what you've done. I didn't realize how much you've sacrificed." Frank sat down at the small table in his living room, motioning for Chris to do the same. He watched the young man closely, seeing the turmoil in his eyes. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," Frank replied, his voice firm but not harsh. "It's easy to judge someone when you don't take the time to understand them." Chris nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I want to understand now. I want to learn from my mistakes." Frank studied him for a moment before speaking. "Mistakes are how we learn, son, but real change comes from doing something about it." Chris looked up, determined. "I'm ready. Whatever I need to do to make things right, I'll do it." Frank nodded, seeing the sincerity in Chris's eyes. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. He hadn't been sure what to expect when Chris showed up at his door, but he could see that the young man was truly seeking redemption. Frank knew that words weren't enough to change someone's life. Actions spoke louder than anything else. And that's when an idea formed in his mind, a test of sorts, to see if Chris was really ready to take responsibility for his actions. "There's something you can do," Frank said slowly, measuring his words. "A friend of mine runs a veterans support group here in town. We help veterans get back on their feet after returning from combat. Some of them need someone to listen. Others need more than that. It's not an easy job, but it's important work. You think you're ready to step up?" Chris blinked, surprised by the offer. He hadn't expected Frank to suggest something like this, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized it made sense. This wasn't just about apologizing to Frank. It was about understanding the struggles veterans like him went through every day. "Yeah," Chris said, nodding with determination. "I'm ready." The next few weeks were tough for Chris. He started volunteering at the Veterans Support Group, working alongside men and women who had seen more of the world than he could ever imagine. The veterans didn't make it easy for him. Some of them barely spoke a word to him, while others were skeptical of his intentions. They had heard about what happened at the diner, and trust wasn't something that came easily to them. But Chris didn't give up. He showed up every day, willing to listen, to help however he could. He learned more in those weeks than he had in his entire life. He listened to the stories of men who had faced death and survived, of women who had fought to protect their country but were now struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. Through it all, Frank watched from a distance, observing the young man's transformation. Chris wasn't the same arrogant boy who had mocked him at the diner. He was becoming something more, someone who understood the value of respect, hard work, and humility. One day, after a long shift at the support group, Chris sat down beside Frank on a bench outside the building. "It's harder than I thought it would be," Chris admitted, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I don't know if I'm making a difference." Frank glanced over at him. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but you're doing the work. That's what matters." Chris nodded, feeling a sense of pride that he hadn't expected. For the first time, he understood what his father had meant about earning respect. It wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to work for, day in and day out. Months passed, and Chris became a regular at the veterans group. He had earned the respect of the people he worked with, not through grand gestures, but through his consistency, his willingness to learn, and his dedication to helping those who needed it. But Frank wasn't done testing him just yet. One afternoon, as they were leaving the support center, Frank pulled Chris aside. "There's one more thing I need you to do," Frank said, his voice serious. "You've come a long way, but there's still one more lesson to learn." Chris's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what Frank was about to ask of him, but he was ready to prove himself. "I want you to come with me to a memorial service," Frank said. "For a man I served with. He didn't make it home. I want you to see what respect really means." Chris nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He understood what Frank was asking of him. This wasn't just about showing up, it was about paying tribute to those who had given everything for their country. It was about understanding the sacrifices that had been made, not just by Frank, but by countless others like him. The memorial service was held at a small military cemetery just outside of town. Chris stood beside Frank, watching as the flag was folded with precision and handed to the widow of the man who had fallen in combat. The silence was heavy, the air thick with emotion. Chris felt a lump in his throat as he watched the ceremony unfold. This was what Frank had been trying to teach him all along. Respect wasn't just about words or actions in the moment. It was about honoring the sacrifices of those who had come before, about understanding that some things were bigger than yourself. As the service ended, Chris turned to Frank, his voice barely a whisper. "I get it now. I really do." Frank nodded, placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. "I know you do, son. I know." From that day on, Chris carried with him the lessons he had learned from Frank. He continued to work with the veterans, earning their respect through his actions. But more importantly, he carried with him a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. Frank, for his part, watched with quiet pride as Chris grew into the man he had always had the potential to be. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth it. Chris had earned his respect, not through words, but through actions. And as the years passed, the story of the young man who had disrespected a veteran, only to be humbled by the lessons he learned, became a quiet legend in the town. But for Chris and Frank, it was more than just a story. It was a bond, forged in respect, that would last a lifetime. Chris's journey hadn't just been about self-growth. It had opened doors to deeper relationships. Months after he began volunteering, his bond with Frank grew stronger, and slowly he was also accepted into Frank's circle of brothers from his old unit. Marcus, Jensen, and Morales had initially been skeptical of the young man who had disrespected their friend, but Chris had earned their quiet approval over time. One evening, Frank invited Chris over for a small reunion dinner. The veterans sat around Frank's living room, sharing old stories, laughing, and remembering their days in service. Chris listened intently, fascinated by the stories, but even more by the respect these men had for each other. The bond between them was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was a brotherhood forged not in words, but in battles fought together, in lives saved, and sacrifices made. As the night went on, Marcus leaned forward, catching Chris's eye. "You've come a long way, kid, but there's something we haven't shared with you yet." The room grew quiet as Marcus continued. "It's not enough to understand respect, Chris. You have to live it. You've been doing good work with the veterans group, but being part of a brotherhood means more than just showing up." Frank nodded, understanding where Marcus was headed. "There's a veterans outreach in a nearby town. It's tougher than the one you've been working with. A lot of the men there are in bad shape, physically and mentally. They don't trust easily. I want you to come with us tomorrow. See if you're ready for the next step." Chris didn't hesitate. "I'm in. Whatever it takes." The next day, Chris, Frank, Marcus, and the others made the drive to the neighboring town. The veterans' outreach there was rough, set up in an old warehouse with a makeshift clinic and shelters for homeless veterans who had fallen through the cracks of the system. The air was heavy with despair, the weight of forgotten stories and lost lives. Chris felt a pang in his chest as they entered the building. These were men and women who had given everything for their country, only to be abandoned in their time of need. The sense of injustice hit him harder than ever before. "This is where it gets real," Frank said quietly as they walked inside. "These people have been through more than you can imagine. If you're serious about wanting to help, this is where you prove it." Chris nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He spent the day doing whatever was needed, handing out supplies, helping with medical checkups, and talking to the veterans who were willing to share their stories. It was grueling work, emotionally and physically draining, but Chris didn't shy away from it. Late in the afternoon, a veteran named Jimmy, a man in his late 40s who had lost both legs in the war, pulled Chris aside. Jimmy had been watching Chris all day, sizing him up. "You really think you belong here, kid?" Jimmy asked, his voice raspy. "You're just another young punk who thinks they can fix everything with a smile and a handshake." Chris met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't think I can fix anything, but I know I can help, and I want to try." Jimmy snorted, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe respect, maybe acknowledgement. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said after a long pause. "He was stubborn too. Didn't know when to quit. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Chris smiled slightly. Maybe not. By the end of the day, Chris was exhausted, but there was a sense of fulfillment that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about being part of something bigger than himself, about earning a place in the brotherhood that Frank and his friends had built over decades. As they drove back to Frank's house, Marcus looked over at Chris from the front seat. "You did good today, kid. You're starting to understand what this is really about." Chris felt a swell of pride in his chest. He had come so far from the arrogant young man who had once mocked Frank in the diner. Now he was earning the respect of men who had fought and bled for each other, men who had seen the worst the world had to offer and still stood tall. Frank glanced at Chris from the driver's seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're proving yourself, Chris. You're earning it." Chris nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "Thank you, Frank, for everything." "It's not about thanking me," Frank replied. "It's about carrying on what we've built. Respect, loyalty, honor. It's a lot to live up to, but I think you're ready." Months passed, and Chris continued working with both the veteran support group in his hometown and the tougher outreach in the neighboring town. He had earned the trust and respect of the veterans he worked with, and more importantly, he had become a part of Frank's circle. The once arrogant boy had grown into a man of character, shaped by the lessons of the veterans who had taken him under their wing. One evening, as Chris and Frank sat on Frank's porch, watching the sun set, Frank turned to him. "You've come a long way, Chris. I'm proud of you," Frank said, his voice soft but full of meaning. Chris smiled, feeling the warmth of Frank's words. "I couldn't have done it without you." Frank shook his head. "You could have walked away a long time ago, but you didn't. You stayed. That's what matters." Chris nodded, knowing that the journey wasn't over. It never would be. The lessons he had learned from Frank, Marcus, and the other veterans would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Chris felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place, not just in Frank's brotherhood, but in a larger world of respect, loyalty, and honor. He knew that he would carry those values with him wherever he went, and he would continue to earn the respect of the people who mattered most. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. Years later, Chris stood at the head of the Veterans Support Group, having taken over after Frank retired. He had become a leader in his own right, guiding young men and women through their own struggles, teaching them the same lessons he had learned from Frank. On the wall of the support center, there was a framed photo of Frank and his unit, taken decades earlier during their time in service. Chris looked at it often, remembering the quiet strength and wisdom that had shaped him. One afternoon, as Chris was closing up the center, a young man walked in. He was cocky, arrogant, with the same swagger that Chris had once carried himself. Chris smiled, recognizing the look in his eyes. The young man had a lot to learn, but Chris was ready to teach him, just as Frank had taught him all those years ago. "Can I help you?" Chris asked, stepping forward. The young man glanced around, clearly out of his element. "Yeah, I heard you guys help people out. I'm not sure where to start." Chris smiled, his mind flashing back to his first meeting with Frank. "You're in the right place. Let's start with respect." And so the cycle continued, as Chris passed on the lessons of respect, loyalty, and honor to a new generation. The brotherhood, it seemed, would never die. The years passed, and time, as it does, marched on. Chris continued to run the Veterans Support Center, earning the trust and respect of more men and women who had walked the same difficult path as Frank and his comrades. He had become a pillar in the community, known not for the mistakes of his youth, but for the man he had become, a leader, a mentor, and a friend to those who needed one most. Frank, now well into his 90s, had grown frailer with age, but his mind remained sharp. He watched with quiet pride as Chris carried forward the legacy of respect and service that he had once lived by. The lessons he and his unit had taught Chris had come full circle, and Frank felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the values they had fought for would live on. One warm autumn evening, Chris received a call that he had been dreading. Frank had passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family. The news hit Chris hard, and for a long moment he sat quietly, letting the weight of the loss settle in. Frank had been more than a mentor. He had been a father figure, a friend, and the man who had changed the course of Chris's life. The town organized a military funeral for Frank, complete with full honors. Chris, along with Marcus, Jensen, and Morales, stood at the gravesite, their hearts heavy with grief but filled with pride for the life Frank had lived. The folded flag was presented to Frank's daughter, who accepted it with tears in her eyes. As the rifle salute echoed through the air and the sound of taps filled the quiet cemetery, Chris felt a profound sense of loss. But he also felt something else, a deep gratitude for the time he had spent with Frank and for the lessons that had shaped him into the man he was. Months after Frank's funeral, Chris sat in his office at the Veterans Center, staring at the photo of Frank and his unit on the wall. The center had become a place of healing and support for countless veterans, and Chris knew that Frank's spirit would always be with them, guiding them, just as it had guided him. One day, as Chris was preparing to leave for the evening, a young man walked into the center. He was rough around the edges, with the same arrogance that Chris had once recognized in himself. "I heard you guys help out vets. I'm looking for some advice," the young man said, his voice unsure. Chris smiled, standing up and extending his hand. "You're in the right place," he said. "Let's talk." As they sat down to talk, Chris realized that he was now the one passing on the lessons that had once saved him. The cycle of respect, loyalty, and brotherhood would continue. Frank had lit the torch, and now Chris carried it forward, ensuring that the legacy of those who served would never be forgotten. And so, the story came full circle. The young man who had once disrespected a veteran had become a leader, helping others find their way in a world that often forgot them. The brotherhood, forged in sacrifice and honor, would live on through every life Chris touched. Frank's story ended as it began, with respect earned through sacrifice and loyalty. Chris had found his place in the world, not as the arrogant youth he once was, but as a man shaped by the lessons of those who had come before him. The legacy of Frank and his comrades lived on, not just in Chris, but in every life he helped to change. The brotherhood would never die, and neither would the values they fought to protect. If Frank's story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to spread the powerful message of respect, loyalty, and brotherhood. What lessons have you learned about honor and respect in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Join our community by subscribing for more moving stories that remind us of the values that truly matter. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our next inspiring tale.